I went straight off to my tailor, who rigged me up in a wondrous khaki garb, which was something between that of a colonel and a brigadier, with silver roses instead of stars or crowns upon the shoulder straps. As I had the right to wear several medals, including the South African, the general effect was all right, but I always felt a mighty imposter, though it was certainly very comfortable and convenient. I was still a rare specimen, and quite a number of officers of 3 nations made inquiry about my silver roses. A deputy lieutenant may not be much in England, but when translated into French, my French anyhow, it has an awe-inspiring effect, and I was looked upon by them as an inscrutable but very big person with a uniform all of his own. It was in May when I had my meeting with Lord Newton, and towards the end of the month I received a pass which would take me to the British lines. I remember the solicitude of my family, who seemed to think that I was going on active service. To quiet their kindly anxieties, I said, "My dears, I shall be held in the extreme rear, and I shall be lucky if ever I see a shell burst on the far horizon." The sequel showed that my estimate was nearly as mistaken as theirs. I had had some correspondence with General Robertson, and had dedicated my history of the war to him. So much was I impressed with the splendid work he had done behind the line in the early days, when Cowans and he had as much strain and anxiety from their position in the wings as any of those who were in the limelight of the stage. He was, as it happened, going over to France, and he sent me a note to ask whether I would like to share his private compartment on the train, and then use his destroyer instead of the ordinary steamer. Of course I was delighted. General Robertson is a sturdy, soldierly, compact man, with a bulldog face, and looks as if he might be obstinate and even sullen if crossed. Such men are splendid if they keep their qualities for the enemy, but possibly dangerous if they use them on their associates. Certainly Robertson had a great deal of fighting to do at home as well as abroad, and was in the latter days of the war in constant conflict with the authorities, and with an open feud against the Prime Minister, but it is hard to say who was right. Perhaps, if it were not for the pressure which Robertson, Repington, and others exercised, it would have been more difficult to raise those last few 100,000 men who saved us in 1918. Like so many big men, his appearance was most deceptive, and though he looked every inch the soldier, there was nothing to show that great capacity for handling a large business, which would surely have put him at the head of any commercial concern in the country. There was a Cromwellian touch in him, which peeped out in occasional religious allusions. He was very engrossed in papers and figures, and I hardly had a word with him between London and Newhaven. We went straight on to the destroyer, and she cast off her moorings within a few minutes. The Channel crossing was a great experience for me, and I stood on the bridge all the time looking about for traces of war, which were not numerous. Just under the bridge stood a sturdy seaman in pea-jacket and flapped cap, an intent, crouching, formidable figure, with his hand on the crank of a quick-firing gun. He never relaxed, and for the whole hour as we tore across, his head and occasionally his gun was slowly traversing from right to left. The captain, a young lieutenant whose name I have forgotten, told me what hellish work it was in the winter, though perhaps hellish is not the mot just for that bitterly cold vigil. His ship was called the Zulu. Shortly afterwards it was blown up, as was its consort the Nubian, but as 2 of the halves were still serviceable, they stuck them together and made one very good ship, the Zubian. You can't beat the British dockyard any more than you can the British Navy which it mothers. That evening we ran through some 20 miles of northern France, and wound up at the usual guest house, where I met several traveling Russians. Colonel Wilson, a dark, quiet, affable man who had the thorny job of looking after the press and brig. General Charteris, a pleasant, breezy, fresh-complexioned soldier, head of the British Intelligence Department, joined us at dinner. Everything was quite comfortable, but at the same time properly plain and simple. There is nothing more hateful than luxury behind a battle line. Next day, I had a wonderful 12 hours in contact with the soldiers all the time, and I will take some account of it from the notes I made at the time, but now I can expand them and give names more freely. The crowning impression which I carried away from that wonderful day was the enormous imperturbable confidence of the army and its extraordinary efficiency in organization, administration, material, and personnel. I met in one day a sample of many types: an army commander, a corps commander, 2 divisional commanders, staff officers of many grades, and above all, I met repeatedly the 2 very great men whom Britain has produced, the private soldier and the regimental officer. Everywhere and on every face one read the same spirit of cheerful bravery. Even the half-mad cranks, whose absurd consciences prevented them from barring the way to the devil, seemed to me to be turning into men under the prevailing influence. I saw a batch of them, neurotic and largely bespectacled, but working with a will by the roadside. There was no foolish bravado, no underrating of a dour opponent, but a quick, alert, confident attention to the job in hand, which was an inspiration to the observer. "Get out of the car, don't let it stay here. It may be hit." These words from a staff officer gave you the first idea that things were going to happen. Up to then you might have been driving through the Black Country in the Walsall district with the population of Aldershot let loose upon its dingy roads. Put on this shrapnel helmet. That hat of yours would infuriate the Boche. This was an unkind allusion to my uniform. Take this gas mask. You won't need it, but it is a standing order. Now come on. We crossed a meadow and entered a trench. Here and there it came to the surface again where there was dead ground. At one such point, an old church stood, with an unexploded shell sticking out of the wall. A century hence folk may journey to see that shell. Then on again through an endless cutting. It was slippery clay below. I had no nails in my boots, an iron pot on my head, and the sun above me. I remember that walk. The telephone wires ran down the side. Here and there large thistles and other plants grew from the clay walls, so immobile had been our lines. Occasionally there were patches of untidiness. "Shells," said the officer laconically. There was a racket of guns before us and behind, especially behind, but danger seemed remote with all these Bairnsfather groups of cheerful Tommies at work around us. I passed one group of grimy, tattered boys. A glance at their shoulders showed me that they were of a public school battalion, the 20th Royal Fusiliers. "I thought you fellows were all officers now," I remarked. "No, sir, we like it better so." "Well, it will be a great memory for you. We are all in your debt." They saluted and we squeezed past them. They had the fresh brown faces of boy cricketers. But their comrades were men of a different type, with hard, strong, rugged features, and the eyes of men who have seen strange sights. These were veterans, men of Mons, and their young pals of the public schools had something to live up to. Up to this we only had two clay walls to look at, but now our interminable and tropical walk was lightened by the sight of a British aeroplane sailing overhead. Numerous shrapnel bursts were all around it, but she floated on serenely, a thing of delicate beauty against the blue background. Now another passed, and yet another. All the morning we saw them circling and swooping, and never a sign of a Boche. They told me it was nearly always so, that we held the air, and that the Boche intruder, save at early morning, was a rare bird. "We have never met a British aeroplane which was not ready to fight," said a captured German aviator. There was a fine, stern courtesy between the airmen on either side, each dropping notes into the other's aerodromes to tell the fate of missing officers. Had the whole war been fought by the Germans as their airmen conducted it, I do not speak, of course, of the Zeppelin murderers, a peace would eventually have been more easily arranged. And now we were there, in what was surely the most wonderful spot in the world, the front firing trench, the outer breakwater which held back the German tide. How strange that this monstrous oscillation of giant forces, setting in from east to west, should find their equilibrium across this particular meadow of Flanders. "How far?" I asked. 180 yards, said my guide. "Pop," remarked a third person just in front. "A sniper," said my guide. "Take a look through the periscope." I did so. There was some rusty wire before me, then a field sloping slightly upwards with knee-deep grass and ragged dock and fennel and nettles, then rusty wire again and a red line of broken earth. There was not a sign of movement, but sharp eyes were always watching us, even as these crouching soldiers around me were watching them. There were dead Germans in the grass before us. You need not see them to know that they were there. A wounded soldier sat in a corner nursing his leg. Here and there men popped out like rabbits from dugouts and mine shafts. Others sat on the fire step or leaned smoking against the clay wall. Who would dream, who looked at their bold, careless faces, that this was a front line, and that at any moment it was possible that a gray wave might submerge them? With all their careless bearing, I noticed that every man had his gas mask and his rifle within easy reach. A mile of front trenches, and then we were on our way back down that weary walk. Then I was whisked off upon a 10-mile drive. There was a pause for lunch at Corps headquarters, and after it, we were taken to a medal presentation in the market square of Bethune. Generals Munro, Haking, and Landon, famous fighting soldiers all three, were the British representatives. Munro with a ruddy face, all brain above, all bulldog below, Haking, pale, distinguished, intellectual, Landon, a pleasant, genial country squire. An elderly French general stood beside them. British infantry kept the ground. In front were about 50 Frenchmen in civil dress of every grade of life, workmen and gentlemen, in a double rank. They were all so wounded that they were back in civil life, but today they were to have some solace for their wounds. They leaned heavily on sticks, their bodies twisted and maimed, but their faces were shining with pride and joy. The French general drew his sword and addressed them. One caught words like honneur and patrie. They leaned forward on their crutches, hanging on every syllable which came hissing and rasping from under that heavy white mustache. Then the medals were pinned on. One poor lad was terribly wounded and needed 2 sticks. A little girl ran out with some flowers. He leaned forward and tried to kiss her, but the crutches slipped and he nearly fell upon her. It was a pitiful but beautiful little scene. Next, the British candidates marched up one by one for their medals. Hale, hardy men, brown and fit. There was a smart young officer of Scottish Rifles, and then a selection of Worcesters, Welsh Fusiliers and Scots Fusiliers, with one funny little Highlander, a tiny figure with a soup bowl helmet, a grinning boy's face beneath it, and a bedraggled uniform. Many acts of great bravery. Such was the record for which he was decorated. Even the French wounded smiled at his quaint appearance, as they did at another Briton who had acquired the chewing gum habit, and came up for his medal as if he had been called suddenly in the middle of his dinner, which he was still endeavoring to bolt. Then came the end, with the national anthem. The British battalion formed 4s and went past. To me, that was the most impressive sight of any. They were the Queen's West Surreys, a veteran battalion of the great Ypres battle. What grand fellows! As the order came, eyes right, and all those fierce, dark faces flashed round at us, I felt the might of the British infantry, the intense individuality which is not incompatible with the highest discipline. Much they had endured, but a great spirit shone from their faces. I confess that as I looked at those brave English lads, and thought of what we owed to them, and to their like who have passed on, I felt more emotional than befits a Briton in foreign parts. How many of them are left alive today? Now the ceremony was ended, and once again we set out for the front. It was to an artillery observation post just opposite the Lewes salient that we were bound. In an hour I found myself, together with a razor-keen young artillery observer and an excellent old sportsman of a Russian prince, jammed into a very small space, and staring through a slit at the German lines. In front of us lay a vast plain, scarred and slashed, with bare places at intervals, such as you see where gravel pits break a green common. Not a sign of life or movement, save some wheeling crows. And yet down there, within a mile or so, was the population of a city. Far away, a single train was puffing at the back of the German lines. We were here on a definite errand. Away to the right, nearly 3 miles off, was a small red house, dim to the eye but clear in the glasses, suspected as a German post. It was to go up this afternoon. The gun was some distance away, but I heard the telephone directions. "Mother will soon do her in," remarked the gunner boy cheerfully. Mother was the name of the gun. "Give her 5634, he cried through the phone. Mother uttered a horrible bellow from somewhere on our right. An enormous spout of smoke rose 10 seconds later from near the house. "A little short," said our gunner. 2.5 minutes left, added a little small voice which represented another observer at a different angle. "Raise her 7.5, said our boy encouragingly. Mother roared more angrily than ever. "How will that do?" she seemed to say. 1.5 right, said our invisible gossip. I wondered how the folk in the house were feeling as the shells crept ever nearer. "Gun laid, sir," said the telephone. "Fire." I was looking through my glass, a flash of fire on the house, a huge pillar of dust and smoke, then it settled and an unbroken field was there. The German post had gone up. "It's a dear little gun," said the officer boy. "And her shells are reliable," remarked a senior behind us. "They vary with different calibers, but mother never goes wrong." The German line was very quiet. "Pourquoi ne répondent ils pas?" asked the Russian prince. "Yes, they are quiet today," answered the senior, "but we get it in the neck sometimes." We were all led off to be introduced to mother, who sat, squat and black, amid 20 of her grimy children who waited upon her and fed her. A dainty eater was mother, and nothing served her but the best and plenty of it. But she was important, and as the war progressed it became more and more evident that in spite of that upstart family of quick-firers, it was really the only big, heavy, well-established gun which could flatten out a road to the Rhine. I had the great joy that night of seeing my brother Inns, who had been promoted to colonel, and was acting as Assistant Adjutant General of the 24th Division, the headquarters of which were at Bailleul, where I dined at mess and occupied a small lodging in the town, which was about 6 miles from the front. One more experience wound up that wonderful day. That night we took a car after dark and drove north, and ever north, until at a late hour we halted and climbed a hill in the darkness. Below was a wonderful sight. Down on the flats, in a huge semicircle, lights were rising and falling. They were very brilliant, going up for a few seconds and then dying down. Sometimes a dozen were in the air at one time. There were the dull thuds of explosions and an occasional rat-tat-tat. I have seen nothing like it, but the nearest comparison would be an enormous 10-mile railway station in full swing at night, with signals winking, lamps waving, engines hissing and carriages bumping. It was a terrible place, a place which will live as long as military history is written, for it was the Ypres salient. What a salient too! A huge curve, as outlined by the lights, needing only a little more to be an encirclement. Something caught the rope as it closed, and that something was the British soldier. But it was a perilous place by day and by night. Never shall I forget the impression of ceaseless, malignant activity which was borne in upon me by the white, winking lights, the red sudden flares, and the horrible thudding noises in that place of death beneath me. In old days we had a great name as organizers. Then came a long period when we deliberately adopted a policy of individuality and go as you please. Now once again in our sore need we had called on all our power of administration and direction, and it had not deserted us. We still had it in a supreme degree. Even in peacetime, we have shown it in that vast, well-oiled, swift-running, noiseless machine called the British Navy. But our powers had risen with the need of them. The expansion of the Navy was a miracle, the management of the transport a greater one, the formation of the new army the greatest of all time. To get the men was the least of the difficulties. To put them in the field, with everything down to the lid of the last field saucepan in its place, that was the marvel. The tools of the gunners and of the sappers, to say nothing of the knowledge of how to use them, were in themselves a huge problem. But it had all been met and mastered. So don't let us talk too much about the muddling of the War Office. It has become just a little ridiculous. I was the guest at headquarters of a divisional general, Capper, brother of the heroic leader of the 7th Division, who might truly be called one of the two fathers of the British flying force, for it was he, with Templar, who laid the first foundations from which so great an organization has arisen. My morning was spent in visiting two fighting brigadiers, Mitford and Jelf, cheery weather-beaten soldiers, respectful, as all our soldiers are, of the prowess of the Hun, but serenely confident that we could beat him. In company with one of them, I ascended a hill, the reverse slope of which was swarming with cheerful infantry in every stage of déshabille, for they were cleaning up after the trenches. Once over the slope we advanced with some care, and finally reached a certain spot from which we looked down upon the German line. It was an observation post, about 1,000 yards from the German trenches, with our own trenches between us. We could see the two lines, sometimes only a few yards as it seemed apart, extending for miles on either side. The sinister silence and solitude were strangely dramatic. Such vast crowds of men, such intensity of feeling, and yet only that open rolling countryside, with never a movement in its whole expanse. In the afternoon, my brother drove me to the square at Ypres. It was the city of a dream, this modern Pompeii, destroyed, deserted, and desecrated, but with a sad, proud dignity which made you involuntarily lower your voice as you passed through the ruined streets. It was a more considerable place than I had imagined, with many traces of ancient grandeur. No words can describe the absolute splintered wreck that the Huns had made of it. The effect of some of the shells had been grotesque. One boiler-plated water tower, a thing 40 or 50 feet high, was actually standing on its head like a great metal top. There was not a living soul in the place save a few pickets of soldiers, and a number of cats which had become fierce and dangerous. Now and then a shell still fell, but the Huns probably knew that the devastation was already complete. We stood in the lonely grass-grown square, once the busy center of the town, and we marveled at the beauty of the smashed cathedral and the tottering cloth hall beside it. Surely at their best, they could not have looked more wonderful. If they were preserved even so, and if a heaven-inspired artist were to model a statue of Belgium in front, Belgium with one hand pointing to the treaty by which Prussia guaranteed her safety, and the other to the sacrilege behind her, it would make the most impressive group in the world. It was an evil day for Belgium when her frontier was violated, but it was a worse one for Germany. I venture to prophesy that it will be regarded by history as the greatest military as well as political error that has ever been made. Had the great guns that destroyed Liege made their first breach at Verdun, what chance was there for Paris? Those few weeks of warning and preparation saved France, and left Germany, like a weary and furious bull, tethered fast in the place of trespass and waiting for the inevitable poleaxe. We were glad to get out of the place, for the gloom of it lay as heavy upon our hearts as the shrapnel helmets did upon our heads. Both were lightened as we sped back past empty and shattered villas to where, just behind the danger line, the normal life of rural Flanders was carrying on as usual. A merry sight helped to cheer us, for scudding downwind above our heads came a Boche aeroplane, with 2 British at her tail barking away with their machine guns, like 2 swift terriers after a cat. They shot rat-tat-tatting across the sky until we lost sight of them in the heat haze over the German line. The afternoon saw us on the Scharpenberg, from which many a million will gaze in days to come, for from no other point can so much be seen. It was a spot forbid, but a special permit took us up, and the sentry on duty, having satisfied himself of our bona fides, proceeded to tell us tales of the war in a pure Hull dialect which might have been Chinese for all that I could understand. That he was a terrier and had 9 children were the only facts I could lay hold of, but I wished to be silent and to think, even perhaps to pray. Here, just below my feet, were the spots which our dear lads, 3 of them my own kith, had sanctified with their blood. Here, fighting for the freedom of the world, they cheerily gave their all. On that sloping meadow to the left of the row of houses on the opposite ridge, the London Scottish fought to the death on that grim November morning when the Bavarians reeled back from their shot-torn line. That plain away on the other side of Ypres was the place where the 3 grand Canadian brigades, first of all men, stood up to the damnable gases of the Hun. Down yonder was H, that blood-soaked copy. The ridge over the fields was held by the cavalry against 2 army corps. And there, where the sun struck the red roof among the trees, I could just see Geluvelt, a name forever to be associated with Hague and the most vital battle of the war. As I turned away, I was faced by my Hull territorial, who still said incomprehensible things. I looked at him with other eyes. He had fought on yonder plain. He had slain Huns, and he had 9 children. Could anyone better epitomize the duties of a good citizen in days like these? I could have found it in my heart to salute him had I not known that it would have shocked him and made him unhappy. Next day, it was June 1, I left my brother's kindly care. I had fears for him, for he was much overworked and worried as adjutant generals of busy divisions are likely to be. However, he was never one to admit it or to pity himself, and he begged me to carry the cheeriest report back to his wife. It was a great pleasure to me that so many officers took me aside to say how efficient he was, and how popular. He would not have wished me to say it were he alive, but I can leave it on record now. Yesterday had been full, but the next day was not less so, for I had been asked, or ordered, to lunch at the general headquarters at Montreuil, the funny old town on a hill which I had learned to know well in days of peace. As we drove down a winding drive, I saw 2 officers walking towards us. The younger of them stooped and beat the ground with his stick, from which we gathered that we were to go slow and raise no dust. We rightly conjectured that so curt an order could only come from the chief's own aide. We saluted as we passed, and carried away an impression of a heavy mustache and of abstracted blue eyes. I had a very much more definite impression when he came back presently, and we were all shown into the dining room. I should certainly put Douglas Haig, as I saw him that day, among the handsomest men I have ever known. He was not tall, but he was upright and well-proportioned with every sign of strength and activity, but his face was remarkable for beauty and power. His eyes were very full and expressive, devoid of the fierceness of Kitchener, and yet with quite as much determination. But the long, powerful jaw was the feature which spoke particularly of that never-to-be-beaten quality, which saved the army when the line was broken in the First Ypres battle, and was destined to save it again in April 1918, when he gave out his back-to-the-wall order of the day. He was courteous but not talkative at lunch. After lunch, he took me into a side room where he showed me the line of the divisions on the map, saying that I could remember but should not take notes, which was rather maddening. Then we had a long talk over the coffee, but there were several present and nothing intimate was said. He must be worried to death with casual visitors, but still I suppose he need not invite all of them to headquarters. He had, I thought, a truly British distrust of foreigners. He is the worst foreigner I have met yet, he said, speaking of some Italian general. His kind heart was shown when I said that my son was in the line. He gave a curt order and then nodded and smiled. "You'll see him tomorrow," said he. I naturally heard a good deal about our Generalissimo, besides what I actually saw. I think that he had some of the traits of Wellington, though since the war he has concerned himself with the fortunes of his comrades in arms a great deal more than the Iron Duke seems ever to have troubled himself to do. But in other things the parallel is close. Haig is not a game-playing man, though fond of horse exercise. Neither was the Duke. Both were abstemious with wine and tobacco. Both were reserved, reticent, and had no magnetic connection with those under them. Neither Haig nor the Duke were human figures to the soldiers, nor were they often if ever seen by them, and yet in each case there was the same confidence in their judgment. Haig was a very serious man. He seldom joked and did not meet a joke halfway, so that his mess was the dullest in France. I have known a staff officer apply for an exchange, so weary was he of this oppressive atmosphere. All this could equally have been said of the Duke. But these are trivialities compared to the great main fact that each brought rare qualities to the service of their country at critical moments of the world's history. There was only one other man who might have filled Haig's place, and that man was the conqueror of Palestine. Extraordinary are the contrasts of war. Within 3 hours of leaving the quiet atmosphere of the headquarters chateau, I was present at what in any other war would have been looked upon as a brisk engagement. As it was, it would certainly figure in one of our desiccated reports as an activity of the artillery. The noise as we struck the line at this new point showed that the matter was serious, and indeed we had chosen the spot because it had been the storm center of the last week. The method of approach chosen by our experienced guide was in itself a tribute to the gravity of the affair. As one comes from the settled order of Flanders into the actual scene of war, the first sign of it is one of the stationary, sausage-shaped balloons, a chain of which marks the ring in which the great wrestlers are locked. We passed under this, ascended a hill, and found ourselves in a garden where for a year no feet save those of wanderers like ourselves had stood. There was a wild, confused luxuriance of growth, more beautiful to my eye than anything which the care of man can produce. One old shell-hole of vast diameter had filled itself with forget-me-nots, and appeared as a graceful basin of light blue flowers, held up as an atonement to heaven for the brutalities of man. Through the tangled bushes we crept, then across a yard. Please stoop and run as you pass this point, and finally to a small opening in a wall, whence the battle lay not so much before as beside us. For a moment we had a front seat at the great world drama, God's own problem play, working surely to its magnificent end. One felt a sort of shame to crouch here in comfort, a useless spectator, while brave men down yonder were facing that pelting shower of iron. There was a large field on our left rear, and the German gunners had the idea that there was a concealed battery therein. They were systematically searching for it. A great shell exploded in the top corner, but got nothing more solid than a few tons of clay. You could read the mind of Gunner Fritz. "Try the lower corner," said he, and up went the earth cloud once again. "Perhaps it's hid about the middle, I'll try." Earth again and nothing more. "I believe I was right the first time after all," said hopeful Fritz. So another shell came into the top corner. The field was full of pits as a Gruyere cheese, but Fritz got nothing by his perseverance. Perhaps there never was a battery there at all. One effect he obviously did attain. He made several other British batteries exceedingly angry. "Stop that tickling, Fritz," was the burden of their cry. Where they were we could no more see than Fritz could, but their constant work was very clear along the German line. We appeared to be using more shrapnel and the Germans more high explosives, but that may have been just the chance of the day. The Vimy Ridge was on our right, and before us was the old French position, with the labyrinth of terrible memories and the long hill of Lorette. When, the year before last, the French, in a 3 weeks' battle, fought their way up that hill, it was an exhibition of sustained courage which even their military annals can seldom have beaten. Kingsley Conan Doyle. Next day we traveled through Acre and hit the British line once more to the east of that place. Our official chauffeur had had his instructions, and so had other people, with the result that as we swung into the broad main street of a village, Mealy, I think, was the name, there was a tall young officer standing with his back turned. He swung round at the noise of the car, and it was my boy Kingsley with his usual jolly grin upon his weather-stained features. The long arm of GHQ had stretched out and plucked him out of a trench, and there he was. We had an hour's talk in a field, for there was nowhere else to go. He was hard and well, and told me that all was nearly ready for a big push at the very part of the line where his battalion, the 1st Hampshires, was stationed. This was the first intimation of the great Somme battle, on the first day of which every officer of the Hampshires without exception was killed or wounded. I learned afterwards that before the battle for 10 nights running, Kingsley crept out to the German wire and stuck up crosses, where he found the wire uncut, which were brown towards the enemy and white towards the British, as a guide to the gunners. He lay on his face sometimes with the machine guns firing just above him. For this service, Colonel Palk thanked him warmly and said he should certainly have a decoration, but Palk and both majors were killed and no recommendations went forward. 2 shrapnel bullets in the neck were all Kingsley got out of the battle, and 2 months on his back in a hospital. However, he was not a medal hunter, and I never heard him complain, nor would he wear his wound badges until he was compelled. An hour later I met another member of my household, for my secretary, Major Wood of the 5th Sussex Territorials, was town major of Beauquesney, where I found him at the convenient hour of lunch. He had done nearly 2 years of hard active service, which was pretty good for a civilian of 50, and had led his company at Festubert and other engagements. He was now using his excellent powers of organization and administration in making Beauquesney a well-ordered village, as later he made Dowlands a well-ordered town. I expect that the British administration will remain as a wonderful legend of sanitation and cleanliness in many of these French towns of the Northeast. After inspecting Major Wood's work, I went on to Amiens with him, and he packed me into the train to Paris, the first part of my task thoroughly done so far as time would permit. I came away with a deep sense of the difficult task which lay before the army, but with an equally deep one of the ability of those men to do all that soldiers can be called upon to perform. But I saw no end to the war. I had 2 days in Paris, a very dead and alive Paris, such a Paris as has seldom or never been seen before, with darkened streets and the shops nearly all closed. I stayed at the Hotel Crillon, where were a few Russian and British officers. It was extraordinary the difference which the public made between the two. A British officer was disregarded, while a Russian general, I took a walk with one, was looked upon with an adulation which was quite comic. Men came up and made a low obeisance before him, and yet it was our army, our purse, our factories, above all our navy, which were saving the situation both for France and Russia, to whom we were bound by no alliance. There was certainly not much sign of appreciation or gratitude. It is a very singular thing how the whole world alternately leans upon and depreciates the British Empire. Chapter 29. Experiences on the Italian Front. The polite front, Udine under fire Carnic Alps, Italia irredenta Trentino, the voice of the Holy Roman Empire. 2 days later I found myself, after an uneventful journey, at Padua on my way to the Italian front. The Italian front seemed to have politely come back to meet me, for I was awakened in the night by a tremendous dropping of bombs, with the rattle of anti-aircraft guns. I thought I was as safe in bed as anywhere, and so it proved. Little damage was done, but Padua and the other Italian cities were having a bad time, and it was a one-sided arrangement, since the Italians can do nothing without injuring their own kith and kin across the border. This dropping of explosives on the chance of hitting one soldier among 50 victims was surely the most monstrous development of the whole war, and was altogether German in its origin. If international law cannot now stamp it out, the next war will send the people flying to the caves and calling upon the mountains to cover them, even as was foretold. I arrived at last at Udine, the capital of the Friulian province, where were the Italian headquarters, a funny little town with a huge mound in the center, which looked too big to be artificial, but was said to have been thrown up by Attila. My recommendation was to the British mission, which was headed by Brig General Delmer Radcliffe, a bluff, short-spoken and masterful British soldier, who received me with hospitality. The mission owned a white house on the edge of the town. On the second floor, under a window which proved to be that of my bedroom, there was a long dark smear on the whitewashed wall. "That's the stomach of a baker," said the soldier servant with a grin. I thought it was a joke on his part, but it was literally true, for a bomb a few days before had blown the man to bits as he passed the house, and had plastered bits of him on the stonework. The ceiling of my bedroom was full of holes from that or some other explosion. There was some tendency at this time to cavil at the Italians, and to wonder why they did not make more impression upon the Austrians. As a matter of fact, they were faced by the same barbed wire and machine gun problem which had held up everyone else. I soon saw, when I was allowed next morning to get to the front, that the conditions were very like those of Flanders in a more genial climate, and in all ways less aggravated. I had been handed over to the Italian intelligence people, who were represented by a charmingly affable nobleman, Colonel the Marquis Barbarich and Colonel Claristi. These two introduced me at once to General Porro, chief of the staff, a brown, wrinkled, walnut-faced warrior who showed me some plans and did what he could to be helpful. It was about a 7 miles drive from Udine before we reached the nearest point of the trenches. From a mound, an extraordinary view could be got of the Austrian position, the general curve of both lines being marked, as in Flanders, by the sausage balloons which float behind them. The Isonzo, which had been so bravely carried by the Italians, lay in front of me, a clear blue river, as broad as the Thames at Hampton Court. In a hollow to my left were the roofs of Gorizia, the town which the Italians were endeavoring to take. A long, desolate ridge, the Carso, extended to the south of the town and stretched down nearly to the sea. The crest was held by the Austrians, and the Italian trenches had been pushed within 50 yards of them. A lively bombardment was going on from either side, but so far as the infantry went, there was none of that constant malignant petty warfare with which we were familiar in Flanders. I was anxious to see the Italian trenches, in order to compare them with our British methods, but save for the support and communication trenches, I was courteously but firmly warned off. Having got this general view of the position, I was anxious in the afternoon to visit Monfalcone, which is the small dockyard captured from the Austrians on the Adriatic. My kind Italian officer guides did not recommend the trip, as it was part of their great hospitality to shield their guest from any part of that danger which they were always ready to incur themselves. The only road to Monfalcone ran close to the Austrian position at the village of Ronchi, and afterwards kept parallel to it for some miles. I was told that it was only on odd days that the Austrian guns were active in this particular section, so determined to trust to luck that this might not be one of them. It proved, however, to be one of the worst on record, and we were not destined to see the dockyard to which we started. The civilian cuts a ridiculous figure when he enlarges upon small adventures which may come his way, adventures which the soldier endures in silence as part of his everyday life. On this occasion, however, the episode was all our own, and had a sporting flavor in it which made it dramatic. I know now the feeling of tense expectation with which the driven grouse whirs onwards towards the butt. I have been behind the butt before now, and it is only poetic justice that I should see the matter from the other point of view. As we approached Ronchi, we could see shrapnel breaking over the road in front of us, but we had not yet realized that it was precisely for vehicles that the Austrians were waiting, and that they had the range marked down to a yard. We went down the road all out at a steady 50 miles an hour. The village was near, and it seemed that we had got past the place of danger. We had, in fact, just reached it. At this moment, there was a noise as if the whole 4 tires had gone simultaneously, a most terrific bang in our very ears, merging into a second sound like a reverberating blow upon an enormous gong. As I glanced up, I saw 3 clouds immediately above my head, 2 of them white and the other of a rusty red. The air was full of flying metal, and the road, as we were told afterwards by an observer, was all churned up by it. The metal base of one of the shells was found plumb in the middle of the road, just where our motor had been. It was our pace that saved us. The motor was an open one, and the 3 shells burst, according to one of my Italian companions, who was himself an artillery officer, about 10 meters above our heads. They threw forward, however, and we, traveling at so great a pace, shot from under. Before they could get in another, we had swung round the curve and under the lee of a house. The good colonel wrung my hand in silence. They were both distressed, these good soldiers, under the impression that they had led me into danger. As a matter of fact, it was I who owed them an apology, since they had enough risks in the way of business, without taking others, in order to gratify the whim of a visitor. Our difficulties were by no means over. We found an ambulance lorry and a little group of infantry huddled under the same shelter, with the expression of people who had been caught in the rain. The road beyond was under heavy fire as well as that by which we had come. Had the Ostroboches dropped a high explosive upon us, they would have had a good mixed bag. But apparently they were only out for fancy shooting and disdained a sitter. Presently there came a lull, and the lorry moved on, but we soon heard a burst of firing which showed that they were after it. My companions had decided that it was out of the question for us to finish our excursion. We waited for some time, therefore, and were able finally to make our retreat on foot, being joined later by the car. So ended my visit to Monfalcone, the place I did not reach. I hear that 2 10,000-ton steamers were left on the stocks there by the Austrians, but were disabled before they retired. Their cabin basins and other fittings were adorning the Italian dugouts. My second day was devoted to a view of the Italian mountain warfare in the Carnic Alps. Besides the 2 great fronts, one of defense, Trentino, and one of offense, Isonze. There were very many smaller valleys which had to be guarded. The total frontier line is over 400 miles, and it had all to be held against raids if not invasions. It was a most picturesque business. Far up in the Roccolana Valley, I found the Alpini outposts, backed by artillery, which had been brought into the most wonderful positions. They had taken 8-inch guns where a tourist could hardly take his knapsack. Neither side could ever make serious progress, but there were continual duels, gun against gun, or Alpini against Jaeger. In a little wayside house was the brigade headquarters, and here I was entertained to lunch. It was a scene that I shall remember. They drank to England. I raised my glass to Italia Irredenta, might it soon be Redenta. They all sprang to their feet, and the circle of dark faces flashed into flame. They keep their souls and emotions, these people. I trust that ours may not become atrophied by self-suppression. The last day spent on the Italian front was in the Trentino. From Verona, a motor drive of about 25 miles takes one up the valley of the Adige, and past a place of evil augury for the Austrians, the field of Rivoli. Finally, after a long drive of winding gradients, always beside the Adige, we reached Ala, where we interviewed the commander of the sector, a man who has done splendid work during the recent fighting. By all means you can see my front, but no motor car, please. It draws fire and others may be hit besides you. We proceeded on foot, therefore, along a valley which branched at the end into 2 passes. In both, very active fighting had been going on, and as we came up the guns were baying merrily, waking up most extraordinary echoes in the hills. It was difficult to believe that it was not thunder. There was one terrible voice that broke out from time to time in the mountains, the angry voice of the Holy Roman Empire. When it came, all other sounds died down into nothing. It was, so I was told, the master gun, the vast 42-centimeter giant which brought down the pride of Liege and Namur. The Austrians had brought one or more from Innsbruck. The Italians assure me, however, as we have ourselves discovered, that in trench work beyond a certain point, the size of the guns makes little matter. We passed a burst dugout by the roadside, where a tragedy had occurred recently, for 8 medical officers were killed in it by a single shell. There was no particular danger in the valley, however, and the aimed fire was all going across us to the fighting lines in the 2 passes above us. That to the right, the valley of Bulow, has seen some of the worst of the fighting. These 2 passes form the Italian left wing, which has held firm all through. So has the right wing. It is only the center which has been pushed in by the concentrated fire. When we arrived at the spot where the 2 valleys forked, we were halted, and were not permitted to advance to the front trenches, which lay upon the crests above us. There were about 1,000 yards between the adversaries. I have seen types of some of the Bosnian and Croatian prisoners, men of poor physique and intelligence, but the Italians speak with chivalrous praise of the bravery of the Hungarians and of the Austrian Jaeger. Some of their proceedings disgusted them, however, and especially the fact that they used Russian prisoners to dig trenches under fire. There is no doubt of this, as some of the men were recaptured and were sent on to join their comrades in France. On the whole, however, it may be said that in the Austro-Italian War, there was nothing which corresponded with the extreme bitterness of our Western conflict. The presence or absence of the Hun makes all the difference. It was a moment of depression at the Trentino front, as there had been a setback. I may flatter myself when I think that even one solitary figure in a British uniform striding about them was good at that particular time to their eyes. They read of allies, but they never saw any. If they had, we might have been spared the subsequent disaster at Caporetto. Certainly I was heartily welcomed there, and surrounded all the time by great mobs of soldiers, who imagined, I suppose, that I was someone of importance. That night found me back at Verona, and next morning I was on my way to Paris with sheaves of notes about the Italian soldiers which would, I hoped, make the British public more sympathetic towards them. I was told afterwards by the Foreign Office that my mission had been an unmixed success. I have one other association with the Italian front, which I may include here. It is embalmed in the annals of the Psychic Research Society. I have several times in my life awakened from sleep, with some strong impressions of knowledge gained still lingering in my brain. In one case, for example, I got the strange name Naldaru so vividly that I wrote it down between 2 stretches of insensibility, and found it on the outside of my checkbook next morning. A month later, I started for Australia in the SS Naldera, of which I had then never heard. In this particular Italian instance, I got the word Piev, absolutely ringing in my head. I knew it as a river some 70 miles to the rear of the Italian front, and quite unconnected with the war. Nonetheless, the impression was so strong that I wrote the incident down and had it signed by 2 witnesses. Months passed, and the Italian battle line was rolled back to the Piave, which became a familiar word. Some said it would go back further. I was sure it would not. I argued that if the abnormal forces, whatever they may be, had taken such pains to impress the matter upon me, it must needs be good news which they were conveying, since I had needed cheering at the time. Therefore I felt sure that some great victory and the turning point of the war would come on the Piave. So sure was I that I wrote to my friend Mr. Lacken Watson, who was on the Italian front, and the incident got into the Italian press. It could have nothing but a good effect upon their morale. Finally, it is a matter of history how completely my impression was justified, and how the most shattering victory of the whole war was gained at that very spot. There is the fact, amply proved by documents and beyond all possible coincidence. As to the explanation, some may say that our own subconscious self has power of foresight. If so, it is a singularly dead instinct, seldom or never used. Others may say that our dead can see further than we, and try when we are asleep and in spiritual touch with us, to give us knowledge and consolation. The latter is my own solution of the mystery. Chapter 30. Experiences on the French front. A dreadful reception. Robert Donald Clemenceau, Soissons Cathedral, the Commandant's cane, the extreme outpost, Adonis, General Henneck, Cyrano in the Argenteur, Rapide, French-Canadian, wound stripes. When I got back to Paris, I had a dreadful reception, for as I dismounted from the railway car, a British military policeman in his flat red cap stepped up to me and saluted. "This is bad news, sir," said he. "What is it?" I gasped. "Lord Kitchener, sir, drowned." "Good God!" I cried. "Yes, sir." Suddenly the machine turned for a moment into a human being. "Too much talking in this war," he said, and then in a moment was his stiff formal self again, and bustled off in search of deserters. Kitchener dead? The words were like clods falling on my heart. One could not imagine him dead, that center of energy and vitality. With a heavy spirit I drove back to my old quarters at the Hotel Krillin, fuller than ever of red-epauletted, sword-clanking Russians. I could have cursed them, for it was in visiting their rotten, crumbling country that our hero had met his end. At the hotel I met by appointment Mr. Robert Donald, editor of the Daily Chronicle, which paper had been publishing my articles. Donald, a fine, solid Scot, had the advantage of talking good French and being in thorough touch with French conditions. With him I called upon M. Clemenceau, who had not at that time played any conspicuous part in the war, save as a violent critic. He lived modestly in a small house, which showed that he had not used his power in the state and in journalism to any unfair personal advantage. He entered, a swarthy, wrinkled, white-haired man, with the face of a crabbed bulldog and a cloth cap upon his head. He reminded me of old Jem Mace the Bruiser, as I remember him in his final phase. His eyes looked angry, and he had a truculent, mischievous smile. I was not impressed by the judgment he showed in our conversation, if a squirt on one side and Niagara on the other can be called conversation. He was railing loudly at the English rate of exchange between the franc and the pound, which seemed to me very like kicking against the barometer. Mr. Donald, who is a real authority upon finance, asked him whether France was taking the ruble at its face value. But the roaring voice, like a strong gramophone with a blunt needle, submerged all argument. Against Joffre, he roared his reproaches, and intimated that he had someone else up his sleeve who could very soon bring the war to an end. A volcano of a man, dangerous sometimes to his friends, and sometimes to his foes. Let me acknowledge that I did not at the time recognize that he would ever be the opposite number to Lloyd George, and that the pair would lead us to victory. Donald had arranged that he and I should visit the French lines in the Argonne, which was as near as we could get to Verdun, where the battle was at its height. There were a few days to spare, however, and in the meantime I got a chance of going to the Soissons front, along with Leo Max, editor of the National Review, and a M. Chevelin, who had written an excellent book on British cooperation in the war. Max, a dark little man, all nerves and ginger, might well plume himself that he was one of those who had foreseen the war and most loudly demanded preparation. Chevelin was a gray-bearded father of a family type, and could speak English, which promoted our closer acquaintance, as my French is adventurous but not always successful. A captain of French intelligence, a small, silent man, took the fourth place in the car. When our posterity hear that it was easy to run out from Paris to the line, to spend a full day on the line, and to be back again in Paris for dinner, it will make them appreciate how close a thing was the war. We passed in the first instance the woods of Villers-Cotterêts, where the guards had turned upon the German van on September 1, 1914. 80 guardsmen were buried in the village cemetery, among them a nephew of Max S., to whose tomb we now made pious pilgrimage. Among the trees on either side of the road, I noticed other graves of soldiers, buried where they had fallen. Soissons proved to be a considerable wreck, though it was far from being an Ypres. But the cathedral would, and will, make many a patriotic Frenchman weep. These savages cannot keep their hands off a beautiful church. Here, absolutely unchanged through the ages, was the spot where St. Louis had dedicated himself to the crusade. Every stone of it was holy. And now the lovely old stained glass strewed the floor, and the roof lay in a huge heap across the central aisle. A dog was climbing over it as we entered. No wonder the French fought well. Such sights would drive the mildest man to desperation. The abbé, a good priest, with a large, humorous face, took us over his shattered domain. When I pointed out the desecration of the dog, he shrugged his shoulders and said, "What matter? It will have to be reconsecrated anyhow." He connived at my gathering up some splinters of the rich old stained glass as souvenirs for my wife. He was full of reminiscences of the German occupation of the place. One of his personal anecdotes was indeed marvelous. It was that a lady in the local ambulance had vowed to kiss the first French soldier who re-entered the town. She did so, and it proved to be her husband. The abbé was a good, kind, truthful man, but he had a humorous face. A walk down a ruined street brought one to the opening of the trenches. There were marks upon the walls of the German occupation, Berlin, Paris, with an arrow of direction, adorning one corner. At another, the 76th Regiment had commemorated the fact that they were there in 1870 and again in 1914. If the Soissons folk are wise, they will keep these inscriptions as reminders to the rising generation. I could imagine, however, that their inclination will be to whitewash, fumigate, and forget. A sudden turn among some broken walls took one into the communication trench. Our guide was a commandant of the staff, a tall, thin man with hard, gray eyes and a severe face. It was the more severe towards us, as I gathered that he had been deluded into the belief that only about 1 out of 6 of our soldiers went to the trenches. For the moment he was not friends with the English. As we went along, however, we gradually got on better terms. We discovered a twinkle in the hard, gray eyes, and the day ended with an exchange of walking sticks between him and me and a renewal of the entente. May my cane grow into a marshal's baton. A charming young artillery subaltern was our guide in that maze of trenches, and we walked and walked and walked, with a brisk exchange of compliments between the 75s of the French and the 77s of the Germans going on high over our heads. The trenches were boarded at the sides, and had a more permanent look than those of Flanders. Presently we met a fine, brown-faced, upstanding boy, as keen as a razor, who commanded this particular section. A little farther on, a helmeted captain of infantry, who was an expert sniper, joined our little party. Now we were at the very front trench. I had expected to see primeval men, bearded and shaggy, but the poilus have disappeared. The men around me were clean and dapper to a remarkable degree. I gathered, however, that they had their internal difficulties. On one board I read an old inscription: "He is a Boche, but he is the inseparable companion of a French soldier." Above was a rude drawing of a louse. I was led to a cunning loophole and had a glimpse through it of a little framed picture of French countryside. There were fields, a road, a sloping hill beyond with trees. Quite close, about 30 or 40 yards away, was a low, red-tiled house. "They are there," said our guide. "That is their outpost. We can hear them cough." Only the guns were coughing that morning, so we heard nothing, but it was certainly wonderful to be so near to the enemy, and yet in such peace. I suppose wondering visitors from Berlin were brought up also to hear the French cough. Modern warfare has certainly some extraordinary sides. Then we were shown all the devices which a year of experience had suggested to the quick brains of our allies. Every form of bomb, catapult, and trench mortar was ready to hand. Every method of crossfire had been thought out to an exact degree. There was something, however, about the disposition of a machine gun which disturbed the commandant. He called for the officer of the gun. His thin lips got thinner and his gray eyes more austere as we waited. Presently there emerged an extraordinarily handsome youth, dark as a Spaniard, from some rabbit hole. He faced the commandant bravely and answered back with respect but firmness. Pourquoi? Asked the commandant, and yet again pourquoi. Adonis had an answer for everything. Both sides appealed to the big captain of snipers, who was clearly embarrassed. He stood on one leg and scratched his chin. Finally, the commandant turned away angrily in the midst of one of Adonis' voluble sentences. His face showed that the matter was not ended. War is taken very seriously in the French army, and any sort of professional mistake is very quickly punished. Many officers of high rank had been broken by the French during the war. There was no more forgiveness for the beaten general than there was in the days of the Republic, when the delegate of the National Convention, with a patent portable guillotine, used to drop in at headquarters to support a more vigorous offensive. It had come on to rain heavily, and we were forced to take refuge in the dugout of the sniper. 8 of us sat in the deep gloom huddled closely together. The commandant was still harping upon that ill-placed machine gun. He could not get over it. My imperfect ear for French could not follow all his complaints, but some defense of the offender brought forth a jamise, 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 which was rapped out as if it came from the gun itself. There were 8 of us in an underground burrow, and some were smoking. Better a deluge than such an atmosphere as that. But if there was a thing upon earth which the French officer shied at, it was rain and mud. The reason is that he was extraordinarily natty in his person. His charming blue uniform, his facings, his brown gaiters, boots and belts were always just as smart as paint. He was the dandy of the European war. I noticed officers in the trenches with their trousers carefully pressed. On the French front. From left, Cyrano, A. Conan Doyle, Mr. Robert Donald, General Henneck. The rain had now stopped, and we climbed from our burrow. Again we were led down that endless line of communication trench. Again we stumbled through the ruins. Again we emerged into the street where our cars were awaiting us. Above our heads, the sharp artillery duel was going merrily forward. The French were firing 3 or 4 to 1, which had been my experience at every point I had touched upon the Allied front. Thanks to the extraordinary zeal of the French workers, especially of the French women, and to the clever adoption of machinery by their engineers, their supplies were abundant. Our next expedition carried us to Chalons, where the Huns of old met disaster. From Chalons we drove some 20 miles to Saint-Ménehould and learned that the trenches were about 10 miles north. On this expedition there were Donald and I with an extraordinary Spaniard, half Don Quixote, half gypsy troubadour, flat-hatted and clad in brown corduroy, with a single arm, having, as we heard, lost the other in some broil. As he spoke no tongue but his own, we were never on terms with him. The front at the sector which we struck was under the control of General Henneck of the 10th Division. A fine soldier this, and heaven help Germany if he and his division had invaded it, for he was, as one could see at a glance, a man of iron who had been goaded to fierceness by all that his beloved country had endured. He was a man of middle size, swarthy, hawk-like, very abrupt in his movements, with 2 steel-gray eyes, which were the most searching that mine have ever met. His hospitality and courtesy to us were beyond all bounds, but there is another side to him, and it is one which it were wiser not to provoke. In person he took us to his lines, passing through the usual shot-torn villages behind them. Where the road dipped down into the great forest, there was one particular spot which was visible to the German artillery observers. The general mentioned it at the time, but his remark seemed to have no personal interest. We understood it better on our return in the evening. We then found ourselves in the depths of the woods, primeval woods of oak and beech in the deep clay soil that the great oak loves. There had been rain, and the forest paths were ankle-deep in mire. Everywhere to right and left, soldiers' faces, hard and rough from a year of open air, gazed up at us from their burrows in the ground. Presently an alert, blue-clad figure stood in the path to greet us. It was the colonel of the sector. He was ridiculously like Cyrano de Bergerac as depicted by the late M. Coquelin, save that his nose was of more moderate proportion. The ruddy coloring, the bristling, feline, full-ended mustache, the solidity of pose, the backward tilt of the head, the general suggestion of the bantam cock, were all there facing us as he stood amid the leaves in the sunlight. Gauntlets and a long rapier, nothing else was wanting. Something had amused Cyrano. His mustache quivered with suppressed mirth and his blue eyes were demurely gleaming. Then the joke came out. He had spotted a German working party, his guns had concentrated on it, and afterwards he had seen the stretchers go forward. A grim joke, it may seem. But the French saw this war from a different angle to us. If we had had the Boche sitting on our heads for 2 years, and were not quite sure whether we could ever get him off again. We should get Cyrano's point of view. We passed in a little procession among the French soldiers and viewed their multifarious arrangements. For them, we were a little break in a monotonous life, and they formed up in lines as we passed. My own British uniform and the civilian dresses of my two companions interested them. As the general passed these groups, who formed themselves up in perhaps a more familiar manner than would have been usual in the British service, he glanced kindly at them with those singular eyes of his, and once or twice addressed them as mes enfants. One might conceive that all was go as you please among the French, so it was as long as you went in the right way. When you strayed from it, you knew it. As we passed a group of men standing on a low ridge which overlooked us, there was a sudden stop. I gazed round. The general's face was steel and cement. The eyes were cold and yet fiery, sunlight upon icicles. Something had happened. Cyrano had sprung to his side. His reddish mustache had shot forward beyond his nose, and it bristled out like that of an angry cat. Both were looking up at the group above us. One wretched man detached himself from his comrades and sidled down the slope. No skipper and mate of a Yankee blood boat could have looked more ferociously at a mutineer. And yet it was all over some minor breach of discipline which was summarily disposed of by 2 days of confinement. Then in an instant the faces relaxed, there was a general buzz of relief, and we were back at mes enfants again. Trenches are trenches, and the main specialty of those in the Argonne were that they were nearer to the enemy. In fact, there were places where they interlocked, and where the advanced posts lay cheek by jowl with a good steel plate to cover both cheek and jowl. We were brought to a saphead where the Germans were at the other side of a narrow forest road. Had I leaned forward with extended hand and a Boche done the same, we could have touched. I looked across, but saw only a tangle of wire and sticks. Even whispering was not permitted in those forward posts. When we emerged from these hushed places of danger, Cyrano took us all to his dugout, which was a tasty little cottage carved from the side of a hill and faced with logs. He did the honors of the humble cabin with the air of a seigneur in his chateau. There was little furniture, but from some broken mansion he had extracted an iron fireback, which adorned his grate. It was a fine medieval bit of work, with Venus in her traditional costume in the center of it. It seemed the last touch in the picture of the gallant virile Cyrano. I only met him this once, nor shall I ever see him again, yet he stands a thing complete within my memory. Always in the cinema of memory he will walk the leafy paths of the Argonne, his fierce eyes searching for the Boche workers, his red mustache bristling over their annihilation. He seems a figure out of the past of France. That night we dined with yet another type of the French soldier, General Antoine, who commanded the corps of which my friend had one division. Each of these French generals had a striking individuality of his own, which I wish I could fix upon paper. Their only common point was that each seemed to be a rare good soldier. The corps general was Athos with a touch of D'Artagnan. He was well over 6 feet high, bluff, jovial, with huge, up-curling mustache, and a voice that would rally a regiment. It was a grand figure, which should have been done by Van Dyck, with lace collar, hand on sword, and arm akimbo. Jovial and laughing was he, but a stern and hard soldier was lurking behind the smiles. His name has appeared in history, and so has Humbert's, who ruled all the army of which the other corps is a unit. Humbert was a Lord Roberts figure, small, wiry, quick-stepping, all steel and elastic, with a short, upturned mustache, which one could imagine as crackling with electricity in moments of excitement like a cat's fur. What he does or says is quick, abrupt, and to the point. He fires his remarks like pistol shots at this man or that. Once to my horror he fixed me with his hard little eyes and demanded, "Sherlock Holmes, est-ce qu'il est un soldat dans l'armée anglaise?" The whole table waited in an awful hush. "Mais, mon general," I stammered, "il est trop vieux pour service." There was general laughter, and I felt that I had scrambled out of an awkward place. And talking of awkward places, I had forgotten about that spot upon the road whence the Boche observer could see our motor cars. He had actually laid a gun upon it, the rascal, and waited all the long day for our return. No sooner did we appear upon the slope than a shrapnel shell burst above us, but somewhat behind me, as well as to the left. Had it been straight, the second car would have got it, and there might have been a vacancy in one of the chief editorial chairs in London. The general shouted to the driver to speed up, and we were soon safe from the German gunners. One got perfectly immune to noises in these scenes, for the guns which surrounded you made louder crashes than any shell which burst about you. It is only when you actually saw the cloud over you that your thoughts came back to yourself, and that you realized that in this wonderful drama you might be a useless super, but nonetheless you were on the stage, and not in the stalls. Next morning we were down in the front trenches again at another portion of the line. Far away on our right, from a spot named the Observatory, we could see the extreme left of the Verdun position and shells bursting on the Fil Mort. To the north of us was a broad expanse of sunny France, nestling villages, scattered chateaux, rustic churches, and all as inaccessible as if it were the moon. It was a terrible thing, this German bar, a thing unthinkable to Britons, to stand on the edge of Yorkshire and look into Lancashire feeling that it was in other hands, that our fellow countrymen were suffering there and waiting for help, and that we could not, after 2 years, come a yard nearer to them. Would it not break our hearts? Could I wonder that there was no smile upon the grim faces of those Frenchmen? But when the bar was broken, when the line swept forward, when French bayonets gleamed on those uplands, and French flags broke from those village spires, ah, what a day that was! Men died that day from the pure delirious joy of it. Yet another type of French general took us round this morning. He, too, was a man apart, an unforgettable man. Conceive a man with a large, broad, good-humored face, and 2 placid, dark, seal's eyes which gazed gently into yours. He was young and had pink cheeks and a soft voice. Such was one of the most redoubtable fighters of France, this general of Division Dupont. His former staff officers told me something of the man. He was a philosopher, a fatalist, impervious to fear, a dreamer of distant dreams amid the most furious bombardment. The weight of the French assault upon the terrible labyrinth fell at one time upon the brigade, which he then commanded. He led them day after day, gathering up Germans with the detached air of the man of science who is hunting for specimens. In whatever shell-hole he might chance to lunch, he had his cloth spread and decorated with wild flowers plucked from the edge. I wrote of him at the time, "If fate be kind to him, he will go far." As a matter of fact, before the end of the war, he was one of the most influential members of the general staff, so my prophetic power was amply vindicated. From the observatory, we saw the destruction of a German trench. There had been signs of work upon it, so it was decided to close it down. It was a very visible brown streak 1,000 yards away. The word was passed back to the 75s in the rear. There was a tur rapide over our heads. My word, the man who stands fast under a tur rapide, be he Boche, French, or British, is a man of metal. The mere passage of the shells was awe-inspiring, at first like the screaming of a wintry wind, and then thickening into the howling of a pack of wolves. The trench was a line of terrific explosions. Then the dust settled down and all was still. Where were the ants who had made the nest? Were they buried beneath it, or had they got from under? No one could say. There was one little gun which fascinated me, and I stood for some time watching it. Its 3 gunners, enormous helmeted men, evidently loved it, and touched it with a swift but tender touch in every movement. When it was fired, it ran up an inclined plane to take off the recoil, rushing up and then turning and rattling down again upon the gunners who were used to its ways. The first time it did it, I was standing behind it, and I don't know which jumped quickest, the gun or I. French officers above a certain rank develop and show their own individuality. In the lower grades, the conditions of service enforce a certain uniformity. The British officer is a British gentleman first, and an officer afterwards. The Frenchman is an officer first, though nonetheless the gentleman stands behind it. One very strange type we met, however, in these Argonne woods. He was a French-Canadian who had been a French soldier, had founded a homestead in far Alberta, and had now come back of his own will, though a naturalized Briton, to the old flag. He spoke English of a kind, the quality and quantity being equally extraordinary. It poured from him and was, so far as it was intelligible, of the woolly Western variety. His views on the Germans were the most emphatic we had met. These goddam sons of, well, let us say canines, he would shriek, shaking his fist at the woods to the north of him. A good man was our compatriot, for he had a very recent Legion of Honor pinned upon his breast. He had been put with a few men on H, a sort of volcano stuffed with mines, and was told to telephone when he needed relief. He refused to telephone and remained there for 3 weeks. "We sit like one rabbit in his hall," he explained. He had only one grievance: there were many wild boars in the forest, but the infantry were too busy to get them. The goddam artillery he get the wild pig. Out of his pocket he pulled a picture of a frame house with snow round it, and a lady with 2 children on the stoop. It was his homestead at Troku, 70 miles north of Calgary. It was the evening of the 3rd day that we turned our faces towards Paris once more. It was my last view of the French. The roar of their guns went far with me upon my way. I wrote at the time, "Soldiers of France, farewell. In your own phrase, I salute you. Many have seen you who had more knowledge by which to judge your manifold virtues, many also who had more skill to draw you as you are, but never one, I am sure, who admired you more than I. Great was the French soldier, under Louis the Sun King, great too under Napoleon, but never was he greater than today. But in spite of all their bravery, only two things saved France, her field guns and the intervention of England. Surely she should have a reckoning with her pre-war military authorities. Imagine unwarlike Britain protected by the sea, and yet having a high standard of musketry, heavy guns with every division and khaki uniforms, while warlike France, under the very shadow of Germany, had poor musketry, primeval uniforms and no heavy guns. As to her early views of strategy, they were lamentable. Every British critic, above all Lord Kitchener, knew that the attack would swing round through Belgium. France concentrated all her preparation upon the eastern frontier. It was clear also that the weaker power should be on the defensive, and so bring her enemy, by heavier losses, down to her own weight. France attacked and broke herself in an impossible venture. There should have been a heavy reckoning against someone. The fate of England as well as of France was imperiled by the false estimates of the French General Staff. One small visible result of my journey was the establishment of wound stripes upon the uniforms of the British. I had been struck by this very human touch among the French, which gave a man some credit, and therefore some consolation for his sufferings. I represented the matter when I came back. Lest I seem to claim more than is true, I append General Robertson's letter. The second sentence refers to that campaign for the use of armor which I had prosecuted so long, and with some success as regards helmets, though there the credit was mostly due to Dr. Saliby, among civilians. The letter runs thus. War Office, August 14, 1916. Many thanks for sending me a copy of your little book. I will certainly see what can be done in regard to armor. You will remember that I took your previous tip as regards badges for wounded men. Yours very truly, W. R. Robertson. Chapter 31. Breaking the Hindenburg Line. Lloyd George, my second excursion, the farthest German point, Sir Joseph Cook, night before the Day of Judgment, the final battle on a tank, horrible sight, speech to Australians, the magic carpet. I find in my diary that the Prime Minister, Mr. Lloyd George, invited me to breakfast in April 1917. Some third person was, I understand, to have been present, but he did not arrive, so that I found myself alone in the classic dining room of number 10, Downing Street, while my host was finishing his toilet. Presently he appeared, clad in a grey suit, smart and smiling, with no sign at all that he bore the weight of the great European war upon his shoulders. Nothing could have been more affable or democratic, for there was no servant present, and he poured out the tea, while I from a side table brought the bacon and eggs for both. He had certainly the Celtic power of making one absolutely at one's ease, for there was no trace at all of pomp or ceremony, just a pleasant, smiling, grey-haired but very virile gentleman, with twinkling eyes and a roguish smile. No doubt there are other aspects, but that is how he presented himself that morning. He began by talking about the great loss which the country had sustained in Lord Kitchener's death, speaking of him in a very kindly and human way. At the same time, he was of opinion that long tropical service, and the habit of always talking down to subordinates, had had some effect upon his mind and character. He was a strange mixture of rather morose inactivity and sudden flashes of prevision, which amounted to genius. He was the only man who had clearly foreseen the length of the war, and but for Turkey, Bulgaria, and other complications, he probably overstated it at 3 years. There were times when he became so dictatorial as to be almost unbearable, and he had to be reminded at a cabinet council, by Lloyd George himself, that he was in the presence of 20 men who were his peers, and that he could not refuse them information or act above their heads. I confess that it struck me as very natural that a big man with vital knowledge in his brain should hesitate in a world crisis to confide it to 20 men, and probably 20 wives, each of whom was a possible leak. In spite of his genius, Kitchener was not accessible to new ideas. He could not see clearly why such enormous munitions were necessary. He opposed tanks. He was against the Irish and Welsh separate divisions. He refused the special flags which the ladies had worked for these divisions. He was as remote from sentiment as a steam hammer, and yet he was dealing with humans who can be influenced by sentiment. He obstructed in many things, particularly in the Dardanelles. On the other hand, his steps in organizing the new armies were splendid, though he had attempted, vainly, to do away with the territorials, another example of his blindness to the practical force of sentiment. Mrs. Squith had said of him, "If he is not a great man, he is a great poster," and certainly no one else could have moved the nation to such a degree, though the long series of provocations from the Germans had made us very receptive and combative. Lloyd George was justly proud of the splendid work of the Welsh division at the front. He had been to Mametz Wood, the taking of which had been such a bloody, and also such a glorious, business. He listened with interest to an account which I was able to give him of some incidents in that fight, and said that it was a beautiful story. He had arranged for a Welsh painter to do the scene of the battle. He was interested to hear how I had worked upon my history, and remarked that it was probably better done from direct human documents than from filed papers. He asked me whether I had met many of the divisional generals, and on my saying that I had, he asked me if any had struck me as outstanding among their fellows. I said I thought they were a fine level lot, but that in soldiering it was impossible to say by mere talk or appearance who was the big man at a pinch. He agreed. He seemed to have a particular feeling towards General Tom Bridges, of the 19th Division, and shortly afterwards I noticed that he was chosen for the American mission. I talked to him about my views as to the use of armor, and found him very keen upon it. He is an excellent listener, and seems honestly interested in what you say. He said he had no doubt that in the problem of armor lay the future of warfare, but how to carry it was the crux. He said that the soldiers always obstructed the idea, which was my experience also, with a few notable exceptions. I mentioned General Watts of the 7th Division as being interested in armor, and he agreed and seemed to know all about Watts who, though a dugout, was one of the finds of the war. He was much excited about the revolution in Russia, news of which had only just come through. The guards had turned, and that meant that all had turned. The Tsar was good but weak. The general character and probable fate of the Tsarina were not unlike those of Marie Antoinette. In fact, the whole course of events was very analogous to the French Revolution. Then it will last some years and end in a Napoleon, said I. He agreed. The revolt, he said, was in no sense pro-German. The whole affair had been Byzantine, and reminded one of the old histories. As I left he came back to armor, and said that he was about to see someone on that very subject. When I was in the hall it struck me that a few definite facts which I had in my head would be useful in such an interview, so, to the surprise of the butler, I sat down on the hall chair and wrote out on a scrap of paper a few headings which I asked him to give the Prime Minister. I don't know if they were of any use. I came away reassured, and feeling that a vigorous, virile hand was at the helm. I had not expected to see any more actual operations of the war, but early in September 1918, I had an intimation from the Australian government that I might visit their section of the line. Little did I think that this would lead to my seeing the crowning battle of the war. It was on September 26 that we actually started, the party consisting of Sir Joseph Cook, Naval Minister of the Australian Commonwealth, Commander Latham, his aide-de-camp, who in civil life is a rising barrister of Melbourne, and Mr. Barry, soon to be Sir William Barry, proprietor of the Sunday Times. We crossed in a gale of wind, with a destroyer sheeted in foam on either side of the leave boat, each of us being obliged to wear life belts. Several American newspaper men were on board, one of them an old friend, Bach of the Ladies' Home Journal. It was too late to continue our journey when we got across, so we stayed at an inn that night, and were off to the Australian line at an early hour in the morning, our way lying through Abbeville and Amiens. The latter place was nearly deserted and very badly knocked about, far more so than I had expected. The enemy had, as we knew, been within 7 miles of Amiens. It was the Australian line which held the town safe, and the Allied cause from desperate peril if not ruin. It did not surprise us, therefore, that we soon came upon signs of fighting. A little grove was shown us as the absolute farthest ripple of the advanced German wave. A little farther on was the sheltered town of Villers-Bretonneux, with piles of empty cartridge cases at every corner to show where snipers or machine guns had lurked. A little farther on a truly monstrous gun, the largest I have ever seen, lay near the road, broken into 3 pieces. It was bigger to my eyes than the largest on our battleships, and had been brought up and mounted by the Germans just before the tide had turned, which was on July 5. In their retreat they had been compelled to blow it up. A party of British guardsmen were standing round it examining it, and I exchanged a few words with them. Then we ran on through ground which was intensely interesting to me, as it was the scene of Gough's retreat, and I had just been carefully studying it at home. There was the Somme on our left, a very placid, slow-moving stream, and across it the higher ground where our Roman III Corps had been held up on the historical August 8, the day which made Ludendorff realize, as he himself states, that the war was lost. On the plain over which we were moving, the Australian and Canadian divisions had swept, with the tanks leading the British line, as Boadicea's chariots did of old. Though I had not been over the ground before, I had visualized it so clearly in making notes about the battle that I could name every hamlet and locate every shattered church tower. Presently a hill rose on the left, which I knew to be Mount St. Quentin, the taking of which by the Australians was one of the feats of the war. It had been defended by picked troops, including some of the Prussian guards, but they were mostly taken or killed, though a flanking attack by the British Yeomanry Division had something to do with the result. The old walled town of Peron, sacred forever to Sir Walter, Quentin Durward, and the archers of the Scots Guards, lay before us, almost if not quite surrounded by the river, the canal, and broad moats. It seemed an impossible place to take, which is of course the greatest possible trap in modern warfare, since something occurring 50 miles away may place troops behind you and cut you off. Here our long drive finished, and we were handed over to the care of Colonel Bennett commanding the camp, a tall, bluff warrior who, if he had doffed his khaki and got into a velvet tunic, would have been the exact image of the veteran warrior in Scott's novel. He was indeed a veteran, having fought, if I remember right, not only in South Africa, but even in the Australian Suakim contingent. A little wooden hut was put at our disposal, and there we slept, Sir Joseph Cook and I, with a small partition between us. I was bitterly cold, and so I can tell was he, for I could hear him tossing about just as I did for warmth. We had neither of us made the discovery that you may pile all the clothes you like on the top of you, but so long as there is only one layer of canvas beneath you, you are likely to be cold. We don't usually realize that the mattress is also part of the bedclothes. We both got little sleep that night. Next morning, September 28, we were off betimes, for we had much to see, the old town for one thing, which I vowed I would visit again in time of peace. We descended Mount St. Quentin and saw ample evidence of the grim struggle that had occurred there. There were many rude graves, some of them with strange inscriptions. One of them, I was told, read, "Here lies a German who met two diggers." The Australian Tommy was of course universally known as a digger. They make a rough, valiant, sporting but rude-handed crew. They went through the prisoners for loot, and even the officers were ransacked. Colonel Bennett told me that a colonel of the Germans was impudent when he came into his presence, so Bennett said, "Mend your manners, or I will hand you over to the diggers." They were waiting outside the tent for just such a chance. One German had an iron cross which was snatched from him by an Australian. The German shaped up to the man in excellent form and knocked him down. The other Australians were delighted, gave him back his cross, and made him quite a hero. I expect the looter had been an unpopular man. The younger Australian officers were all promoted from the ranks, and many of them had their own ideas about English grammar. Bennett told me that he tried to get the reports better written. One subaltern had reported, "As I came round the traverse I met a Boche and we both reached for our guns, but he lost his block and I got him." Bennett returned this for emendation. It came back, "As I came round the traverse I met a German, and we both drew our automatic pistols, but he lost his presence of mind and I shot him." I think I like the first style best. I lunched that day at the headquarters of Sir John Monash, an excellent soldier who had done really splendid work, especially since the advance began. Indeed, it was his own action on July 5 which turned the tide of retreat. He showed that the long line of fighting Jews which began with Joshua still carries on. One of the Australian divisional generals, Rosenthal, was also a Jew, and the headquarters staff was full of eagle-nosed, black-haired warriors. It spoke well for them, and well also for the perfect equality of the Australian system, which would have the best man at the top, be he who he might. My brother was acting as assistant adjutant general to General Butler, with the Roman III British Corps on the left of the Australians, and they had kindly wired for him, so that I had the joy of having him next me at lunch, and he invited me to join the headquarters mess of his corps for dinner. It was a wonderful experience, that dinner. The great advance was to be next morning, when it was hoped that the Hindenburg Line, which was practically the frontier of Germany, would be carried. There were only 6 who dined in that little farmhouse messroom. Butler himself with hard, composed face, his head of sappers, head of gunners, my brother, the first and second staff officers, a little group of harassed and weary men. Yet there was no word of the huge drama upon the edge of which we were standing. Every now and then a telephone tinkled in the next room, a staff officer rose, there were a few short words, a nod, and the incident was closed. It was a wonderful example of quiet self-control. I said to my brother when we were alone, "Don't you think I am out of the picture at such a moment talking about such frivolous things?" "For God's sake, keep on at it," he said. "It is just what they need. Give their brains something new." So I tried to do so, and we had a memorable evening. I shall never forget the drive back of 10 miles in a pitch-dark night, with not a gleam anywhere save that far aloft 2 little gold points glimmered now and again, like the far-off headlights of a motor transferred suddenly to the heavens. These were British aeroplanes, so lit to distinguish them from the German marauders. The whole eastern horizon was yellow-red with gunfire, and the distant roar of the artillery preparation was like the Atlantic surge upon a rock-bound coast. Along the road no lights were permitted, and several times out of the black, a still blacker gloom framed itself into some motor lorry with which only our cries saved a collision. It was wonderful and awesome, the eve of the Day of Judgment when Germany's last solid defense was to be smashed, and she was to be left open to that vengeance which she had so long provoked. We were awakened early, part of our party getting away to some point which they imagined would be more adventurous than that to which we seniors should be invited, though in the sequel it hardly proved so. They saw much, however, and one of them described to me how one of the first and saddest sights was that of 18 splendid young Americans lying dead and lonely by the roadside, caught in some unlucky shell burst. Mr. Cook, Commander Latham, and I had been placed under the charge of Captain Plunkett, a twice-wounded Australian officer, who helped us much during the varied adventures of our exciting day. The general program of attack was already in our minds. 2 American divisions, the 27th Anth, one from New York, the other from the south, were to rush the front line. The Australian divisions were then to pass over or through them and carry the battlefront forward. Already, as we arrived on the battlefield, the glad news came back that the Americans had done their part, and that the Australians had just been unleashed. Also that the Germans were standing to it like men. As our car threaded the crowded street between the ruins of Templu, we met the wounded coming back. Covered cars with nothing visible save protruding boots, and a constant stream of pedestrians, some limping, some with bandaged arms and faces, some supported by Red Cross men, a few in pain, most of them smiling grimly behind their cigarettes. Amid them came the first clump of prisoners, 50 or more, pitiable enough, and yet I could not pity them, the weary, shuffling, hangdog creatures, with no touch of nobility in their features or their bearing. The village was full of Americans and Australians, extraordinarily like each other in type. One could well have lingered, for it was all of great interest, but there were even greater interests ahead, so we turned up a hill, left our car which had reached its limit, and proceeded on foot. The road took us through a farm, where a British anti-aircraft battery stood ready for action. Then we found open plain, and went forward, amid old trenches and rusty wire, in the direction of the battle. We had now passed the heavy gun positions, and were among the field guns, so that the noise was deafening. A British howitzer battery was hard at work, and we stopped to chat with the major. His crews had been at it for 6 hours, but were in great good humor, and chuckled mightily when the blast of one of their guns nearly drove in our eardrums, we having got rather too far forward. The effect was that of a ringing box on the exposed ear, with which valediction we left our grinning British gunners and pushed on to the east, under a screaming canopy of our own shells. The wild, empty waste of moor was broken by a single shallow quarry or gravel pit, in which we could see some movement. In it we found an advanced dressing station, with about 100 American and Australian gunners and orderlies. There were dugouts in the sides of this flat excavation, and it had been an American battalion headquarters up to a few hours before. We were now about 1,000 yards from the Hindenburg line, and I learned with emotion that this spot was the Egg Redoubt, one of those advanced outposts of General Gough's army, which suffered so tragic and glorious a fate in that great military epic of March 21, one of the grandest in the whole war. The fact that we were now actually standing in the Egg Redoubt showed me, as nothing else could have done, how completely the ground had been recovered, and how the day of retribution was at hand. We were standing near the eastward lip of the excavation, and looking over it, when it was first brought to our attention that it took 2 to make a battle. Up to now we had seen only 1. Now 2 shells burst in quick succession 40 yards in front of us, and a spray of earth went into the air. Whiz-bangs, remarked our soldier guide casually. Personally, I felt less keenly interested in their name than in the fact that they were there at all. We thought we had done pretty well to get within 1,000 yards of the famous line, but now came a crowning bit of good fortune, for an Australian gunner captain, a mere lad, but a soldier from his hawk's eyes to his active feet, volunteered to rush us forward to some coign of vantage known to himself. So it was eastward ho, once more, still over a dull, barren plain sloping gently upwards, with little sign of life. Here and there was the quick fluff of a bursting shell, but at a comfortable distance. Suddenly ahead of us a definite object broke the skyline. It was a tank, upon which the crew were working with spanners and levers, for its comrades were now far ahead, and it would fain follow. This, it seems, was the grandstand which our young gunner had selected. Onto the top of it we clambered, and there, at our very feet, and less than 500 yards away, was the rift which had been torn a few hours before in the Hindenburg line. On the dun slope beyond it, under our very eyes, was even now being fought a part of that great fight where at last the children of light were beating down into the earth the forces of darkness. It was there. We could see it. And yet how little there was to see. The ridge was past, and the ground sloped down, as dark and heathy as Hindhead. In front of us lay a village. It was Bellecourt. The Hindenburg position ran through it. It lay quiet enough, and with the unaided eye one could see rusty red fields of wire in front of it. But the wire had availed nothing, nor had the trench that lurked behind it, for beyond it, beside the village of Norrie, there was a long white line, clouds of pale steam-like vapor spouting up against a dark, rain-sodden sky. "The Boche smoke barrage," said our guide. "They are going to counterattack." Only this, the long, white, swirling cloud upon the dark plain told of the strife in front of us. With my glasses I saw what looked like tanks, but whether wrecked or in action I could not say. There was the battle, the greatest of battles, but nowhere could I see a moving figure. It is true that all the noises of the pit seemed to rise from that lonely landscape, but noise was always with us, go where we would. The Australians were ahead where that line of smoke marked their progress. In the sloping fields, which at that point emerged out of the moor, the victorious Americans, who had done their part, were crouching. It was an assured victory upon which we gazed, achieved so rapidly that we were ourselves standing far forward in ground which had been won that day. The wounded had been brought in, and I saw no corpses. On the left the fight was very severe, and the Germans, who had been hidden in their huge dugouts, were doing their usual trick of emerging and cutting off the attack. So much we gathered afterwards, but for the moment it was the panorama before us which was engrossing all our thoughts. Suddenly the German guns woke up. I can but pray that it was not our group which drew their fire upon the half-mended tank. Shell after shell fell in its direction, all of them short, but creeping forward with each salvo. It was time for us to go. If any man says that without a call of duty he likes being under aimed shell fire, he is not a man whose word I would trust. Some of the shells burst with a rusty red-out flame, and we were told that they were gas shells. I may say that before we were admitted on to the battlefield at all, we were ushered one by one into a room where some devil's pipkin was bubbling in the corner, and were taught to use our gas masks by the simple expedient of telling us that if we failed to acquire the art then, and there a very painful alternative was awaiting us. We made our way back, with no indecent haste, but certainly without loitering, across the plain, the shells always getting rather nearer, until we came to the excavation. Here we had a welcome rest, for our good gunner took us into his cubby-hole of a dugout, which would at least stop shrapnel, and we shared his tea and dried beef, a true Australian soldier's meal. The German fire was now rather heavy, and our expert host explained that this meant that he had recovered from the shock of the attack, had reorganized his guns, and was generally his merry self once more. From where we sat, we could see heavy shells bursting far to our rear, and there was an atmosphere of explosion all round us, which might have seemed alarming had it not been for the general chatty afternoon tea appearance of all these veteran soldiers, with whom it was our privilege to find ourselves. A group of sulky-looking German prisoners sat in a corner, while a lank and freckled Australian soldier, with his knee sticking out of a rent in his trousers, was walking about with 4 watches dangling from his hand, endeavoring vainly to sell them. Far be it from me to assert that he did not bring the watches from Sydney and choose this moment for doing a deal in them, but they were heavy old Teutonic timepieces, and the prisoners seemed to take a rather personal interest in them. As we started on our homeward track we came, first, upon the British battery, which seemed to be limbering up with some idea of advancing, and so lost its chance of administering a box on our other ear. Farther still, we met our friends of the air guns, and stopped again to exchange a few impressions. They had nothing to fire at, and seemed bored to tears, for the red, white, and blue machines were in full command of the sky. Soon we found our motor waiting in the lee of a ruined house, and began to thread our way back through the wonderfully picturesque streams of men, American, Australian, British, and German, who were strung along the road. And then occurred a very horrible incident. One knew, of course, that one could not wander about a battlefield and not find oneself sooner or later involved in some tragedy, but we were now out of range of any but heavy guns, and their shots were spasmodic. We had halted the car for an instant to gather up 2 German helmets, which Commander Latham had seen on the roadside, when there was a very heavy burst close ahead round a curve in the village street. A geyser of red brick dust flew up into the air. An instant later our car rounded the corner. None of us will forget what we saw. There was a tangle of mutilated horses, their necks rising and sinking. Beside them, a man with his hand blown off was staggering away, the blood gushing from his upturned sleeve. He was moving round and holding the arm raised and hanging, as a dog holds an injured foot. Beside the horses lay a shattered man, drenched crimson from head to foot, with 2 great glazed eyes looking upwards through a mask of blood. 2 comrades were at hand to help, and we could only go upon our way with the ghastly picture stamped forever upon our memory. The image of that dead driver might well haunt one in one's dreams. Once through Templu, and on the main road for Peron things became less exciting, and we drew up to see a column of 900 prisoners pass us. Each side of the causeway was lined by Australians, with their keen, clear-cut, falcon faces, and between lurched these heavy-jawed, beetle-browed, uncouth louts, new caught and staring round with bewildered eyes at their debonair captors. I saw none of that relief at getting out of it which I have read of, nor did I see any signs of fear, but the prevailing impression was an ox-like stolidity and dullness. It was a herd of beasts, not a procession of men. It was indeed farcical to think that these uniformed bumpkins represented the great military nation, while the gallant figures who lined the road belonged to the race which they had despised as being unwarlike. Time and fate between them have a pretty sense of humor. One of them caught my eye as he passed and roared out in guttural English, "The old German is out." They were the only words I heard them speak. French cavalry troopers, stern, dignified, and martial, rode at either end of the bedraggled procession. They were great soldiers, these Australians. I think they would admit it themselves, but a spectator is bound to confirm it. There was a reckless daredevilry, combined with a spice of cunning, which gave them a place of their own in the imperial ranks. They had a great advantage, too, in having a permanent organization, the same 5 divisions always in the same corps, under the same chief. It doubled their military value, and the same applied equally, of course, to the Canadians. Nonetheless, they should not undervalue their British comrades, or lose their sense of proportion. I had a chance of addressing some 1,200 of them on our return that evening, and while telling them all that I thought of their splendid deeds, I ventured to remind them that 72% of the men engaged in percent of the casualties were Englishmen of England. I think that now, in these afterwar days, the whole world needs to be reminded of this fact as well as the Australians did. There has been, it seems to me, a systematic depreciation of what the glorious English, apart from the British, soldiers did. England is too big to be provincial, and smaller minds sometimes take advantage of it. At the time, some of the Australian papers slanged me for having given this speech to their soldiers, but I felt that it needed saying, and several of their officers thanked me warmly, saying that as they never saw anything save their own front, they were all of them losing their sense of proportion. I shall not easily forget that speech. I standing on a mound in the rain, the Australian soldiers with cloaks swathed round them like brigands, and half a dozen aeroplanes, returning from the battle, circling overhead, evidently curious as to what was going on. It seems to me now like some extraordinary dream. Such was my scamper to the Australian front. It was as if some huge hand had lifted me from my study table, placed me where I could see what I was writing about, and then within 4 days laid me down once more before the familiar table, with one more wonderful experience added to my record. And then at last came the blessed day of armistice. I was in a staid London hotel at 11 o'clock in the morning, most prim of all the hours of the day, when a lady, well-dressed and conventional, came through the turning doors, waltzed slowly round the hall with a flag in either hand, and departed without saying a word. It was the first sign that things were happening. I rushed out into the streets, and of course the news was everywhere at once. I walked down to Buckingham Palace and saw the crowds assembling there, singing and cheering. A slim, young girl had got elevated onto some high vehicle and was leading and conducting the singing as if she was some angel in tweeds just dropped from a cloud. In the dense crowd, I saw an open motor stop with 4 middle-aged men, one of them a hard-faced civilian, the others officers. I saw this civilian hack at the neck of a whiskey bottle and drink it raw. I wish the crowd had lynched him. It was the moment for prayer, and this beast was a blot on the landscape. On the whole, the people were very good and orderly. Later, more exuberant elements got loose. They say that it was when the Australian wounded met the War Office flappers that the foundations of solid old London got loosened. But we have little to be ashamed of, and if ever folk rejoiced, we surely had the right to do so. We did not see the new troubles ahead of us, but at least these old ones were behind. And we had gained an immense reassurance. Britain had not weakened. She was still the Britain of old. Chapter 32. The Psychic Quest. I have not obtruded the psychic question upon the reader, though it has grown in importance with the years, and has now come to absorb the whole energy of my life. I cannot, however, close these scattered memories of my adventures in thought and action without some reference, however incomplete, to that which has been far the most important thing in my life. It is the thing for which every preceding phase, my gradual religious development, my books, which gave me an introduction to the public, my modest fortune, which enables me to devote myself to unlucrative work, my platform work, which helps me to convey the message, and my physical strength, which is still sufficient to stand arduous tour and to fill the largest halls for an hour and a half with my voice, have each and all been an unconscious preparation. For 30 years, I have trained myself exactly for the role, without the least inward suspicion of whither I was tending. I cannot, in the limited space of a chapter, go into very lengthy detail or complete argument upon the subject. It is the more unnecessary, since I have already in my psychic volumes outlined very clearly how I arrived at my present knowledge. Of these volumes, the first and second, called respectively The New Revelation and The Vital Message, show how gradual evidence was given me of the continuation of life, and how thorough and long were my studies before I was at last beaten out of my material agnostic position and forced to admit the validity of the proofs. In the days of universal sorrow and loss, when the voice of Rachel was heard throughout the land, it was borne in upon me that the knowledge which had come to me thus was not for my own consolation alone, but that God had placed me in a very special position for conveying it to that world which needed it so badly. I found in the movement many men who saw the truth as clearly as I did, but such was the clamor of the religious, who were opposing that which is the very essence of living religion, of the scientific, who broke the first laws of science by pronouncing upon a thing which they had not examined, and of the press, who held up every real or imaginary rascality as being typical of a movement which they had never understood, that the true men were abashed and shrank from the public exposition of their views. It was to combat this that I began a campaign in 1916, which can only finish when all is finished. One grand help I had. My wife had always been averse from my psychic studies, deeming the subject to be uncanny and dangerous. Her own experiences soon convinced her to the contrary, for her brother, who was killed at Mons, came back to us in a very convincing way. From that instant she threw herself with all the wholehearted energy of her generous nature into the work which lay before us. A devoted mother, she was forced often to leave her children. A lover of home, she was compelled to quit it for many months at a time. Distrustful of the sea, she joyfully shared my voyages. We have now traveled 0 miles upon our quest. We have spoken face to face with 250,000 of people. Her social qualities, her clear sanity, her ardent charity, and her gracious presence upon the platforms, all united with her private counsel and sympathy, have been such an aid to me that they have turned my work into a joy. The presence of our dear children upon our journeys has also lightened them for both of us. I began our public expositions of the subject by 3 years of intermittent lecturing in my country, during which period I visited nearly every town of importance, many of them twice and thrice. Everywhere I found attentive audiences, critical, as they should be, but open to conviction. I roused antagonism only in those who had not heard me, and there were demonstrations outside the doors, but never in the halls. I cannot remember a single interruption during that long series of addresses. It was interesting to notice how I was upheld, for though I was frequently very weary before the address, and though my war lectures had often been attended by palpitation of the heart, I was never once conscious of any fatigue during or after a lecture upon psychic subjects. On August 13, 1920, we started for Australia. In proportion to her population, she had lost almost as heavily as we during the war, and I felt that my seed would fall upon fruitful ground. I have written all details of this episode in my Wanderings of a Spiritualist, in which the reader will find, among other things, some evidences of that preternatural help which went with us in our journeys. I addressed large audiences in all the big towns of Australia and New Zealand. An unfortunate shipping strike prevented me from reaching Tasmania, but otherwise the venture was an unalloyed success. Contrary to expectation, I was able to pay all the expenses of our large party, we were 7, and to leave a balance behind me to help the successor whom I might choose. At the end of March 1921, we were back in Paris again, where, greatly daring, I lectured in French upon psychic subjects. Our stay at home was not a very long one, for urgent invitations had come from America, where the spiritual movement had fallen into a somewhat languishing state. On April 1922, our whole party started for the States. What happened to us I have recorded in our American adventure. Suffice it to say that the trip was very successful, and that from Boston to Washington, and from New York to Chicago, I spoke in all the larger cities and brought about a great revival of interest in the subject. We were back in England at the beginning of July 1922. I was by no means satisfied about America, however, as we had not touched the Great West, the land of the future. Therefore we set forth again in March 1923, getting back in August. Our adventures, which were remarkable upon the psychic side, are recorded in our second American adventure. When I returned from that journey, I had traveled 0 miles in 3 years and spoken to 250,000 of people. I am still unsatisfied, however, for the southern states of the Union have not been touched, and it is possible that we may yet make a journey in that direction. I have placed on record our experiences, and no doubt they have little interest at the moment for the general public. But the day will come, and that speedily, when people will understand that this proposition for which we are now fighting is far the most important thing for 2,000 years in the history of the world, and when the efforts of the pioneers will have a very real interest to all who have sufficient intelligence to follow the progress of human thought. I am only one of many working for the cause, but I hope that I may claim that I brought into it a combative and aggressive spirit which it lacked before, and which has now so forced it upon public attention that one can hardly pick up a paper without reading some comment upon it. If some of these papers are hopelessly ignorant and prejudiced, it is not a bad thing for the cause. If you have a bad case, constant publicity is a misfortune, but if you have a good one, its goodness will always assert itself, however much it may be misrepresented. Many spiritualists have taken the view that since we know these comforting and wonderful things, and since the world chooses not to examine the evidence, we may be content with our own happy assurance. This seems to me an immoral view. If God has sent a great new message of exceeding joy down to earth, then it is for us, to whom it has been clearly revealed, to pass it on at any cost of time, money, and labor. It is not given to us for selfish enjoyment, but for general consolation. If the sick man turns from the physician, then it cannot be helped, but at least the healing draught should be offered. The greater the difficulty in breaking down the wall of apathy, ignorance, and materialism, the more is it a challenge to our manhood to attack, and ever attack in the same bulldog spirit with which Foch faced the German lines. I trust that the record of my previous life will assure the reader that I have within my limitations preserved a sane and balanced judgment, since I have never hitherto been extreme in my views, and since what I have said has so often been endorsed by the actual course of events. But never have I said anything with the same certainty of conviction with which I now say that this new knowledge is going to sweep the earth, and to revolutionize human views upon every topic, save only on fundamental morality, which is a fixed thing. All modern inventions and discoveries will sink into insignificance beside those psychic facts, which will force themselves within a few years upon the universal human mind. The subject has been obscured by the introduction of all sorts of side issues, some of interest but not vital, others quite irrelevant. There is a class of investigator who loves to wander round in a circle, and to drag you with him if you are weak enough to accept such guidance. He trips continually over his own brains, and can never persuade himself that the simple and obvious explanation is also the true one. His intellect becomes a positive curse to him, for he uses it to avoid the straight road and to fashion out some strange devious path which lands him at last in a quagmire, whilst the direct and honest mind has kept firmly to the highway of knowledge. When I meet men of this type, and then come in contact with the lowly congregations of religious spiritualists, I think always of Christ's words when he thanked God that he had revealed these things to babes and withheld them from the wise and the prudent. I think also of a dictum of Baron Reichenbach. There is a scientific incredulity which exceeds in stupidity the obtuseness of the clodhopper. But what I say in no way applies to the reasonable researcher whose experiences are real stepping stones leading to his fixed conclusion. There must to every man be this novitiate in knowledge. The matter is too serious to be taken without due intellectual conviction. It must not be imagined that I entirely deny the existence of fraud, but it is far less common than is supposed, and as for its being universal, which is the theory of the conjurers and some other critics, such an opinion is beyond reason or argument. In an experience with mediums which has been excelled by very few living men, and which has embraced 3 continents, I have not encountered fraud more than 3 or 4 times. There is conscious and unconscious fraud, and it is the existence of the latter which complicates the question so badly. Conscious fraud usually arises from a temporary failure of real psychic power, and a consequent attempt to replace it by an imitation. Unconscious fraud comes in that curious halfway state, which I have called the half-trance condition, when the medium seems normal, and yet is actually hardly responsible for his actions. At such a time, the process by which his personality leaves his body seems to have set in, and his higher qualities have already passed, so that he can apparently no longer inhibit the promptings received from the suggestion of those around him, or from his own unchecked desires. Thus one will find mediums doing stupid and obvious things which expose them to the charge of cheating. Then, if the observer disregards these and waits, the true psychic phenomena of unmistakable character will follow as he sinks more deeply into trance. This was, I gather, noticeable in the case of Eusapia Palladino, but I have seen it with several others. In those cases where a medium has left the cabinet and is found wandering about among the sitters, as has happened with Mrs. Corner, with Madame d'Espérance, and with Craddock, all of them mediums who have given many proofs of their real powers, I am convinced that the very natural supposition that they are fraudulent is really quite a mistaken one. When, on the other hand, it is found that the medium has introduced false drapery or accessories, which has sometimes occurred, we are in the presence of the most odious and blasphemous crime which a human being can commit. People ask me, not unnaturally, what it is which makes me so perfectly certain that this thing is true. That I am perfectly certain is surely demonstrated by the mere fact that I have abandoned my congenial and lucrative work, left my home for long periods at a time, and subjected myself to all sorts of inconveniences, losses, and even insults, in order to get the facts home to the people. To give all my reasons would be to write a book rather than a chapter, but I may say briefly that there is no physical sense which I possess which has not been separately assured, and that there is no conceivable method by which a spirit could show its presence which I have not on many occasions experienced. In the presence of Miss Bassinet as medium and of several witnesses, I have seen my mother and my nephew, young Oscar Hornung, as plainly as ever I saw them in life, so plainly that I could almost have counted the wrinkles of the one and the freckles of the other. In the darkness the face of my mother shone up, peaceful, happy, slightly inclined to one side, the eyes closed. My wife upon my right and the lady upon my left both saw it as clearly as I did. The lady had not known my mother in life, but she said, "How wonderfully like she is to her son," which will show how clear was the detail of the features. On another occasion, my son came back to me. 6 persons heard his conversation with me and signed a paper afterwards to that effect. It was in his voice and concerned itself with what was unknown to the medium, who was bound and breathing deeply in his chair. If the evidence of 6 persons of standing and honor may not be taken, then how can any human fact be established? My brother, General Doyle, came back with the same medium, but on another occasion. He discussed the health of his widow. She was a Danish lady, and he wanted her to use a masseur in Copenhagen. He gave the name. I made inquiries and found that such a man did exist. Whence came this knowledge? Who was it who took so close an interest in the health of this lady? If it was not her dead husband, then who was it? All fine-drawn theories of the subconscious go to pieces before the plain statement of the intelligence. I am a spirit. I am ins. I am your brother. I have clasped materialized hands. I have held long conversations with the direct voice. I have smelt the peculiar ozone-like smell of ectoplasm. I have listened to prophecies which were quickly fulfilled. I have seen the dead glimmer up upon a photographic plate which no hand but mine had touched. I have received through the hand of my own wife notebooks full of information which was utterly beyond her ken. I have seen heavy articles swimming in the air, untouched by human hand, and obeying directions given to unseen operators. I have seen spirits walk round the room in fair light and join in the talk of the company. I have known an untrained woman, possessed by an artist's spirit, to produce rapidly a picture, now hanging in my drawing room, which few living painters could have bettered. I have read books which might have come from great thinkers and scholars, and which were actually written by unlettered men who acted as the medium of the unseen intelligence, so superior to his own. I have recognized the style of a dead writer which no parodist could have copied, and which was written in his own handwriting. I have heard singing beyond earthly power, and whistling done with no pause for the intake of breath. I have seen objects from a distance, projected into a room with closed doors and windows. If a man could see, hear, and feel all this, and yet remain unconvinced of unseen intelligent forces around him, he would have good cause to doubt his own sanity. Why should he heed the chatter of irresponsible journalists, or the head-shaking of inexperienced men of science, when he has himself had so many proofs? They are babies in this matter, and should be sitting at his feet. It is not, however, a question to be argued in a detached and impersonal way, as if one were talking of the Baconian theory or the existence of Atlantis. It is intimate, personal, and vital to the last degree. A closed mind means an earthbound soul, and that in turn means future darkness and misery. If you know what is coming, you can avoid it. If you do not, you run grave risk. Some Jeremiah or Savonarola is needed who will shriek this into the ears of the world. A new conception of sin is needed. The mere carnal frailties of humanity, the weaknesses of the body, are not to be lightly condoned, but are not the serious part of the human reckoning. It is the fixed condition of mind, narrowness, bigotry, materialism. In a word, the sins not of the body but of the spirit, which are the real permanent things, and condemn the individual to the lower spheres until he has learnt his lesson. We know this from our rescue circles, when these poor souls come back to bewail their errors, and to learn those truths which they might have learnt here, had their minds not been closed by apathy or prejudice. The radical mistake which science has made in investigating the subject is that it has never troubled to grasp the fact that it is not the medium who is producing the phenomena. It has always treated him as if he were a conjurer and said, "Do this or do that," failing to understand that little or nothing comes from him, but all or nearly all comes through him. I say nearly all, for I believe that some simple phenomena, such as the rap, can within limits be produced by the medium's own will. It is this false view of science which has prevented skeptics from realizing that a gentle and receptive state of mind on the part of sitters, and an easy natural atmosphere for the medium, are absolutely essential in order to produce harmony with the outside forces. If in the greatest of all seances, that of the upper room on the day of Pentecost, an aggressive skeptic had insisted upon test conditions of his own foolish devising, where would the rushing wind and the tongues of fire have been? All with one accord, says the writer of the Acts of the Apostles, and that is the essential condition. I have sat with saintly people, and I too have felt the rushing wind, seen the flickering tongues and heard the great voice, but how could such results come where harmony did not reign? That is the radical mistake which science has made. Men know well that even in her own course, material work, the presence of a scrap of metal, may upset the whole balance of a great magnetic installation, and yet they will not take the word of those who are in a position to speak from experience that a psychic condition may upset a psychic experiment. But indeed, when we speak of science in this connection, it is a confusion of thought. The fact that a man is a great zoologist like Lankester, or a great physicist like Tyndall or Faraday, does not give his opinion any weight in a subject which is outside his own specialty. There is many an unknown Smith and Jones whose 20 years of practical work have put him in a far stronger position than that of these intolerant scientists. While as to the real spiritualist leaders, men of many experiences and much reading and thought, it is they who are the real scientific experts who are in a position to teach the world. One does not lose one's judgment when one becomes a spiritualist. One is as much a researcher as ever, but one understands better what it is that one is studying and how to study it. This controversy with bumptious and ignorant people is a mere passing thing which matters nothing. The real controversy, which does matter very much, is with the continental school who study ectoplasm and other semi-material manifestations, but who have not got the length of seeing independent spirit behind them. Richet, Schrenck-Notzing, and other great investigators are still in this midway position, and Flammarion is little more advanced. Richet goes the length of admitting that he has assured himself by personal observation of the materialized form that it can walk and talk and leave molds of its hands. So far he has gone, and yet even now he clings to the idea that these phenomena may be the externalization of some latent powers of the human body and mind. Such an explanation seems to me to be the desperate defense of the last trench by one of those old-time materialists who say with Brewster, "Spirit is the last thing which we will concede," adding as their reason, it upsets the work of 50 years. It is hard when a man has taught all his life that the brain governs spirit to have to learn, after all, that it may be spirit which acts independently of the human brain. But it is their supermaterialism which is the real difficulty with which we now have to contend. And what is the end of it all? I have no idea. How could those who first noted the electric twitching of muscles foresee the Atlantic cable or the arc lamp? Our information is that some great shock is coming shortly to the human race, which will finally break down its apathy, and which will be accompanied by such psychic signs that the survivors will be unable any longer to deny the truths which we preach. The real meaning of our movement will then be seen, for it will become apparent that we have accustomed the public mind to such ideas, and provided a body of definite teaching, both scientific and religious, to which they can turn for guidance. As to the prophecy of disaster, I admit that we have to be on our guard. Even the Christ Circle was woefully deceived, and declared confidently that the world would not survive their own generation. Various creeds, too, have made vain predictions of the end of the world. I am keenly aware of all this, and also of the difficulty in reckoning time when seen from the other side. But making every allowance for this, the information upon the point has been so detailed, and has reached me from so many entirely independent sources, that I have been forced to take it seriously, and to think that some great watershed of human experience may be passed within a few years, the greatest, we are told, that our long-suffering race has yet encountered. People who have not gone into the subject may well ask, but what do you get out of it? How are you the better? We can only answer that all life has changed to us since this definite knowledge has come. No longer are we shut in by death. We are out of the valley and up on the ridge, with vast clear vistas before us. Why should we fear a death which we know for certain is the doorway to unutterable happiness? Why should we fear our dear ones, death, if we can be so near to them afterwards? Am I not far nearer to my son than if he were alive and serving in that army medical service which would have taken him to the ends of the earth? There is never a month, often never a week, that I do not commune with him. Is it not evident that such facts as these change the whole aspect of life and turn the gray mist of dissolution into a rosy dawn? You may say that we have already all these assurances in the Christian revelation. It is true, and that is why we are not anti-Christians so long as Christianity is the teaching of humble Christ, and not of his arrogant representatives. Every form of Christianity is represented in our ranks, often by clergymen of the various denominations. But there is nothing precise in the definitions of the other world, as given in the holy writings. The information we have depicts a heaven of congenial work and of congenial play, with every mental and physical activity of life carried on to a higher plane, a heaven of art, of science, of intellect, of organization, of combat with evil, of home circles, of flowers, of wide travel, of sports, of the mating of souls, of complete harmony. This is what our dead friends describe. On the other hand, we hear from them, and sometimes directly, of the hells, which are temporary spheres of purification. We hear of the mists, the darkness, the aimless wanderings, the mental confusion, the remorse. Our condition is horrible, wrote one of them to me recently at a séance. These things are real and vivid and provable to us. That is why we are an enormous force for the resuscitation of true religion, and why the clergy take a heavy responsibility when they oppose us. The final result upon scientific thought is unthinkable, save that the sources of all force would be traced rather to spiritual than to material causes. In religion, one can perhaps see a little more clearly. Theology and dogma would disappear. People would realize that such questions as the number of persons in God or the process of Christ's birth have no bearing at all upon the development of man's spirit, which is the sole object of life. All religions would be equal, for all alike produce gentle, unselfish souls who are God's elect. Christian, Jew, Buddhist, and Mohammedan would shed their distinctive doctrines, follow their own high teachers on a common path of morality, and forget all that antagonism which has made religion a curse rather than a blessing to the world. We shall be in close touch with other world forces, and knowledge will supersede that faith which has in the past planted a dozen different signposts to point in as many different directions. Such will be the future, so far as I can dimly see it, and all this will spring from the seed which now we tend and water amid the cold blasts of a hostile world. Do not let it be thought that I claim any special leadership in this movement. I do what I can, but many others have done what they could, many humble workers who have endured loss and insult, but who will come to be recognized as the modern apostles. For my part, I can only claim that I have been an instrument so fashioned that I have had some particular advantages in getting this teaching across to the people. That is the work which will occupy, either by voice or pen, the remainder of my life. What immediate shape it will take I cannot say. Human plans are vain things, and it is better for the tool to lie passive until the great hand moves it once more.